Welcome to the Tenant Law Podcast, where all types of New York City tenants can learn about the laws that affect their apartments. Rent-stabilized tenants, free market tenants, good cause tenants, luxury tenants, loft law tenants, co-op shareholders, subletters, roommates, co-livers. Let's all learn to live better. Welcome to the Tenant Law Podcast, where we talk about new, interesting, and/or important laws and legal cases affecting New York City tenants. First, we give you some background so you have the context to understand the topic that we are discussing. Then we talk about the law itself, and finally, we explain why the law is important to you and give you our tenant takeaway. I'm Michelle Itkowitz, and today we are discussing the new Local Law 1 of 2024, which allows you to make complaints that HPD is obligated to follow up on regarding unoccupied apartments in your building. Now, this raises two important questions. First, why would a landlord not rent out empty apartments? And second, why would perpetually empty apartments bother other tenants in a building? There is a phenomena in New York City where a rent-regulated tenant leaves an apartment after being there for a long time, where sometimes a landlord does not re-rent that apartment. The landlord might perceive that the cost of getting the apartment in rentable shape, which is pretty worn down after somebody living there for decades, is more than they will make over a long period of time with a new rent-regulated tenant, which is going to be a below market rent. Now, I'm not saying that landlords are right for this practice. I'm also not saying that they're wrong. This is a political issue, and this is not a political show. There are no shortage of those. You can go somewhere else for that. This show is about the practical things that you can do right now to live better in your New York City apartment. And my point simply is that there's really no dispute that many apartments right now in New York City are being warehoused. The reason it's tough on existing tenants to have units that are warehoused and sitting empty is because, you know the saying, idle hands do the devil's work? Well, empty apartments are a source of a lot of problems in a building. Usually the apartments that are warehoused are apartments that were in bad shape to begin with. If there's a persistent leak and nobody is there living in the apartment to complain about it, then the leak can go on, and it can cause a worse leak that can come into your apartment, or a mold condition, a bad mold condition on walls, ceilings, and floors that can get worse and worse and end up affecting other apartments, either via the air circulation in the building or from the condition spreading on surfaces. Empty apartments can be havens for mice and rats. Sometimes, if the heat is not on in an empty apartment, it can cause pipes to freeze and burst. What if there's no one changing the batteries in the smoke detector in an unoccupied apartment? And God forbid there's a gas leak in an empty unit. And then there are other problems. Sometimes building personnel who are aware that an apartment is being kept empty will use the apartment behind the owner's back for nefarious purposes. The owner's not on site and the super is, so the super has a lot of power. So sometimes supers or building managers get up to untoward things in vacant apartments. Even worse, sometimes people from the outside break in and will squat in an empty apartment. And that is extremely bad for the legitimate tenants of the building. So next, we look closely at this new law that offers us some alternatives to this situation. Now let's get into New York City Local Law 1 of 2024. There is a link to the exact law in the show notes. In late 2023, the New York City Council added provisions to the New York City Administrative Code to require a multiple dwelling owner to keep all unoccupied dwelling units in good repair, and to permit inspection by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development of these units within 21 days of receipt of complaints about conditions in the units that affect occupied dwelling units in a building. Now, those complaints can be about anything, but there's actually a specific list of things that are suggested that can be looked at in the statute. And those are unsecured openings, inadequate fire stopping, leaks, defective plumbing and mold, indications of the presence of any pests, accumulation of refuse, and smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. Now, remember, a multiple dwelling, that's what this law applies to. A multiple dwelling is a building with 3 or more units. So that's what this law applies to. The law does not apply to unoccupied dwelling units in the New York City Housing Authority buildings. And the law kicks in August 2024. The law also requires HPD to maintain a publicly accessible interface on the website of the department that lists violations issued. So I guess that will probably start in August when the law kicks in. It's interesting because in this way, the law might be creating a database of unoccupied units, and that might have some type of political significance in the future, who knows. But for our purposes, all of this leads to some very interesting tenant takeaways. But first, let's get the housekeeping out of the way. This is not legal advice, and I am not your lawyer, but because I am a lawyer, this might be considered legal advertising. If it's legal advertising, it is terrible because I am asking you not to contact me. This pod is not a commercial for me or my law firm. This is simply the podcast that I always wanted to make. Let us know what topics you would like to hear more about. If you like our work, please give us 5 stars and put this podcast on your socials. It is time for the tenant takeaway. Tenant takeaway time. So this new law gives you a tool to use to stimulate the landlord to keep empty apartments in good shape and to check them regularly. It's a great new tool because before this, a tenant could complain about conditions in their own apartment or in common areas, but not about conditions in an apartment that they were not entitled to be inside of. This is a great new tool for tenants. If you have a persistent leak in your apartment and it's coming from somewhere above you, you can ask the question, are there any empty apartments in the line above mine? I think you're entitled to an answer to that question. And as per this new law, you can get HPD into that unit as well as into your unit within 3 weeks of a complaint, which, by the way, as per the new statute, these complaints can also be made in the context of a housing court case. Another tip is that organizing a tenant association is good for so many reasons. And one of those reasons is that if you have a lot of eyes and ears throughout the building, you could know where these empty apartments are located. You might not know that there is an empty apartment right above you, but your neighbor on the floor above you in the tenant association might. So this is an issue I would encourage tenant associations to pay attention to. And there you have it. Remember, New York City, the law belongs to you. But your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I am Michelle Itkowitz, and this is the Tenant Law Podcast.